The call came in just before dawn. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end of the line was barely above a whisper. There's blood. Everywhere. The dispatcher straightened instinctively. There was something in the caller's voice. Not just panic, but pure, unfiltered terror. Where are you, ma'am? The address was in Kansas City. The operator hesitated. They had received a call from that same address just a few weeks ago. A woman had reported feeling unsafe but declined to press charges. Now they were back. And it was too late. The first patrol unit arrived within minutes. Officers stepped cautiously through the front door, which was slightly ajar. The house was eerily quiet. There were no signs of a struggle in the living room, no broken furniture, no shattered glass. But then they followed the smell. A heavy metallic scent clung to the air, leading them downstairs to the basement. The fluorescent light flickered. A woman lay sprawled on the cold concrete floor. Her skin was pale, her long blonde hair darkened by the pool of blood beneath her. Stab wounds riddled her torso, deep and violent. It was an execution, not an accident. One of the officers stepped closer, his breath catching when he noticed something unusual. Written across the woman's bare leg, just above the knee, was a word: wonder. Blood had dried in jagged streaks where her fingers had smeared the letters. One of the officers turned away, swallowing hard. Another muttered under his breath. Detective Michael Jensen arrived minutes later. With over 20 years on the force, he had seen his fair share of homicide cases. But something about this scene unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. The crime was brutal, but it was the message that sent a chill down his spine. The coroner was already examining the body when Jensen crouched beside him. She wrote it herself. If I had to guess, yeah, the coroner muttered. This wasn't immediate. She had enough time, barely, to leave this behind. A dying declaration. Jensen looked back at the victim. Her name was Ashli Erhardt, 29 years old, recently separated, preparing to start a new life away from her husband. She had told friends she was finally free. Instead, she had spent her last moments bleeding out on a cold basement floor, clawing her husband's name into her own skin. John Wonder. They weren't officially divorced yet, but Ashli had been planning to move out within the next few days. Friends described her as hopeful, relieved even. She had been laughing about how she was going to decorate her new place. But something had changed between then and now. John wasn't at the scene. The officers had checked the house, but he was gone. His car was missing. His phone went straight to voicemail. That alone wasn't proof of guilt, but it certainly wasn't helping his case. Neighbors were already gathered outside by the time Jensen stepped back into the cool morning air. A few gave the usual lines. I never thought something like this would happen. They seemed normal. But one elderly woman hesitated when he asked if she had noticed anything unusual. There was yelling last night, she admitted finally. It was bad. Worse than usual. Did you call the police? She shook her head, eyes downcast. Number I should have. I just thought. I don't know what I thought. Jensen didn't respond. It wouldn't have made a difference now. He flipped through his notes. No history of domestic violence charges, but people don't always report abuse. That didn't mean it wasn't happening. Ashli had last spoken to a friend around 9 p.m. She had sounded fine, even excited. Then silence. Her phone showed no outgoing messages or calls after that time. By 2 a.m., the lights in the basement were still on, according to a neighbor who had stepped outside for a smoke. He had seen shadows moving through the window, but he hadn't thought much of it. At 3:47 a.m., Ashli's phone shut off for good. By 4:15 a.m., John Wonder's debit card was used at a gas station 200 miles away. He was running. Jensen exhaled sharply. He had no doubt in his mind. John Wonder had killed his wife. Now all he had to do was prove it. An all-points bulletin was issued by noon. Traffic cameras picked up John's silver sedan heading west. He wasn't trying to hide. He was just trying to get as far away as possible. Jensen had seen it before. Men who thought that if they just put enough miles between themselves and the crime, they might somehow outrun it. Meanwhile, forensics combed through the basement. The blood spatter pattern was inconsistent with an immediate fatal wound. Ashli had fallen first, then tried to crawl away. The depth of the stab wound suggested rage. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't premeditated. It was personal. Jensen lingered a moment longer in the basement, staring at the letters smeared on her leg. He had seen some desperate last messages in his time. Victims trying to dial 911, whispering names into the phone before collapsing. But this was different. She had written it for them to find. The last thing she ever did was name her killer. Jensen turned away, jaw tight. John Wonder had nowhere to hide, and they were coming for him. Detective Michael Jensen had seen men run before. They always thought they could slip away, as if crossing state lines could erase the blood on their hands. But the truth always caught up with them. The moment John Wonder's name hit the wire, he became a marked man. Every highway patrol officer, every state trooper within 500 miles had their eyes on his silver sedan. It was only a matter of time. Jensen sat at his desk, staring at the crime scene photos spread out before him. The blood on the basement floor, the letters smeared across Ashli's leg, the desperate final message of a woman who knew she was dying. He tapped his pen against the desk, a rhythmic sound cutting through the silence of the precinct. The evidence was damning. The forced intimacy of the crime, the rage behind each wound, the very name written in her own blood. It all pointed to one man. And yet he needed more. The forensic report was still incomplete, and without a confession, the prosecution would need a bulletproof case. The knock on his office door came sharply. "We got him." Jensen's eyes lifted. "Where?" "Valentine, Nebraska. Pulled over at a rest stop. Guy was sitting in his car like he didn't have a care in the world." The detective exhaled through his nose. It figured. Most killers weren't masterminds. They weren't criminal geniuses plotting elaborate escapes. They were desperate, impulsive, sloppy. They made mistakes. They lingered too long, thought too little, and John Wonder was no exception. Jensen grabbed his coat. "Let's bring him in." The interview room was small and dimly lit, designed to make suspects uncomfortable. John Wonder sat on the opposite side of the steel table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked nothing like a man consumed with grief. No frantic tears, no broken sobs. Just a vacant stare and a slight twitch in his jaw as he avoided eye contact. Jensen took his time. He set the case file down with a quiet thud, flipped it open, slowly slid the photos across the table. The crime scene, the body, the letters. John barely glanced at them. Jensen leaned forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "Tell me what happened." John exhaled, rubbing his hands together as if suddenly cold. "I wasn't there." A lie, a bad one. Jensen tilted his head slightly. "Then where were you?" He hesitated just for a second. "I left. Drove out of town the night before." "Funny," Jensen said, tapping a finger on the photo of the bloodied message, "because Ashli seems to disagree." John swallowed hard. His pupils were dilated, his hands restless against the metal cuffs. Jensen studied him, letting the silence stretch. Most men cracked under silence faster than they did under words. "You know what I think?" Jensen continued, his voice still even, almost conversational. "I think you were angry. I think you and Ashli got into a fight. I think she told you she was leaving for good, and you snapped." John's jaw tightened. "You killed her, John." "No." Jensen didn't blink. "Then how did your name end up written in her blood?" Silence. John's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers curling into fists. He was unraveling, but he wasn't ready to break just yet. Jensen leaned back, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We found your fingerprints in the blood. Your debit card was used hours later, 200 miles away. Your phone? Shut off right after her death." He let out a slow breath. "So tell me again, where were you?" John looked up, something flickering in his eyes. Fear, guilt, and something else. Something darker. Outside the interview room, Assistant District Attorney Lauren Porter stood with her arms crossed, watching through the one-way mirror. She had seen plenty of suspects try to outmaneuver detectives before. Some lawyered up immediately, others played the denial game until the walls closed in. But this was different. John Wonder wasn't just denying, he was waiting. For what, she didn't know. But she had prosecuted enough cases to recognize when someone thought they had an out. She turned to Jensen as he stepped into the hallway. "He's not giving us anything, is he?" Jensen shook his head. Not yet. She exhaled, rubbing her temples. We need that forensic report. If we can place him there definitively, the DA will have everything they need. It's coming, Jensen assured her. But he knew that wasn't enough. Juries wanted a confession, a moment of guilt, a cracked voice, a single misstep that confirmed what they already knew. Without that, cases could turn, and John Wonder didn't look like a man ready to confess. Not yet. Forensics worked through the night, cataloging every piece of evidence. Blood spatter analysis, DNA testing, the autopsy report. Every detail would paint a clearer picture of what had happened in that basement. Ashli had suffered multiple stab wounds, but the fatal one had come last. She had been alive long enough to understand she was dying, long enough to write the name of her killer. But there was something else. One of the forensic techs called Jensen early the next morning. We found something, the man said, voice tight. Jensen sat up straighter. What is it? A pause, then, blood. Jensen frowned. We already knew that. Not just hers, the tech clarified. His. A fresh wound, a defensive injury. John Wonder had left something behind, and now they had him. Detective Michael Jensen sat at his desk, staring at the forensic report in his hands. The words blurred slightly as he read them for the third time. Not because he didn't understand them, but because of what they confirmed. John Wonder had bled at the scene. Somewhere in the violent struggle of that night, he had left behind a part of himself, a careless mistake, a gash on his hand, deep enough to mark him as the killer. It was the kind of oversight that sealed cases, the kind that turned suspicions into undeniable facts. Forensics had matched his DNA to a blood smear on the concrete floor, separate from Ashli's. The sample had been mixed with hers, overlapping in places where the struggle had been most intense. The pattern suggested he had struck her first, the impact splitting open his knuckles, before she had fallen to the ground, bleeding out beneath him. It was proof. In a court of law, juries like stories. They like to understand motives, emotions, relationships. But blood? Blood was a fact. It didn't lie. It couldn't be explained away. And now, John Wonder had nowhere left to run. Jensen let the report fall to the desk, rubbing a hand over his jaw. It had been a long 48 hours, and exhaustion sat heavy in his bones. The weight of the case, the brutal intimacy of it, settled like a stone in his chest. He had worked homicides before, seen the aftermath of unspeakable violence. But this one was different. Maybe it was the way Ashli had fought, the way she had used her last moments to name her killer. Maybe it was the sheer cruelty of it, the fact that she had almost made it out, almost escaped. She had been so close. Her suitcases were still upstairs, half-packed. A pile of folded sweaters on the bed, a row of shoes lined neatly by the door. There had been a note on her dresser, a list of last-minute things to grab before she left. Charger, passport, coffee mug. Small things. Things that didn't matter now. Jensen could picture her in that house, standing at the edge of her new life. She had been ready to go, and instead she had died on a cold basement floor, alone and afraid. That thought sat with him as he pushed back from his desk, grabbing his coat. He needed air, needed a moment away from the crime scene photos, the forensic reports, the relentless logic of evidence and timelines. Stepping outside, he let the cold morning air clear his head, the hum of the city grounding him back in reality. Kansas City wasn't a town built for high-profile murder cases. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where couples hosted backyard barbecues and sent Christmas cards in the mail. But under that layer of normalcy, darkness could hide. It could fester inside homes that looked just like any other, behind the smiles of people who seemed ordinary. John Wonder had been one of those people. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, a man who kept to himself, who mowed his lawn on Sundays and waved when passing by. There had been no prior police reports, no documented history of domestic violence. But when Jensen had started digging, he had found something that made his stomach turn. Ashli had tried to leave before. Not officially, not with paperwork or police involvement, but there had been times when she had stayed with friends for days at a time. Nights when she had texted people, saying she didn't want to go home. A handful of messages buried in group chats, Little red flags that no one had fully recognized until now. There had been an incident 6 months prior. Ashley had gone to visit her sister out of state and had extended her trip longer than planned. When she finally returned home, something had shifted. She had told a friend she thought John was different, that he had been quieter, watching her more. That was when she had started looking for apartments. Jensen thought about that as he drove back to the station, the city rolling past in blurred streaks of light and shadow. There was always a pattern to these cases, a slow, creeping escalation. Violence didn't start with a murder. It built over time, layer by layer, a tightening grip, a veiled threat, a moment of anger that passed too quickly to question. John Wonder had spent months losing control over his wife, watching as she pulled away, as she carved out a future without him. The night he killed her wasn't a moment of sudden rage. It was the final act in a story that had been unfolding for a long time. And now, there was nothing left but the aftermath. Back at the precinct, the air felt thick with tension. Assistant DA Lauren Porter was already waiting when Jensen stepped inside, a file tucked under her arm. She had the kind of expression that meant she wasn't here for small talk. "We have enough," she said, skipping the usual pleasantries. "Between the forensic evidence, the financial records, and the timeline, we have him locked in. The DA's office is filing charges for first-degree murder." Jensen nodded, but there was no satisfaction in it. Justice didn't bring people back. It didn't make the crime disappear. It was just a way of tying up loose ends, of making sure no one else suffered the same fate. "Good," he said simply. Porter studied him for a moment before shifting her weight. "You should get some rest. You look like hell." Jensen let out a dry chuckle, but he knew she was right. The case had taken over every hour of his life for the past 2 days, and the worst part was that it wasn't over yet. John Wonder was still in an interview room down the hall, silent behind a one-way mirror. He hadn't asked for a lawyer. He hadn't said much of anything since his initial denial. It was as if he was waiting for something. But Jensen had seen men like him before. He knew how this would play out. John would sit there for hours, maybe even a full day, clinging to the hope that he could still talk his way out of it. But eventually the truth would become unavoidable. And when that moment came, Jensen would be there, watching, waiting, ready for the moment when the weight of what he had done finally broke him. For now, though, it was just a matter of time. The night Ashli Erhardt died had started like any other. She had spoken to a friend in the evening, finalizing the details of her move. Her voice had been light, tinged with something close to relief. She was almost free. She had spent months preparing for this moment, lining up an apartment, quietly separating finances, making sure she had everything in place. Her new life was waiting for her, but she never made it out of that house. Detective Michael Jensen pieced together her final hours from a combination of digital records, security footage, and the scattered recollections of neighbors. The timeline was incomplete, fragmented, but some things were clear. At 9:12 p.m., she had sent a text. "Tomorrow's the day. I can't wait to be out of here." At 9:27 p.m., she had played a song on her phone. Something upbeat. Maybe she was packing, maybe just letting herself enjoy a brief moment of peace. By 10:45 p.m., the activity on her phone had stopped. The last person to see her alive was a neighbor across the street, a man who had been taking out his trash around 11. He had noticed her bedroom light was still on, but that wasn't unusual. By 2 a.m., the light in the basement was on instead. At 3:47 a.m., her phone was powered off for the last time. Sometime in between, she had been murdered. Jensen stood in the basement, looking at the space where she had fallen. The room was sterile now, cleared of evidence, but the echoes of that night still lingered in the air. He could almost picture it, the way the argument had started. Maybe quiet at first, maybe just a tense exchange of words. Then the anger, the fear, the shift from control to violence. He had seen it too many times before. John Wonder had watched his wife slip away from him for months. He had seen her prepare to leave, piece by piece, until all that was left was the moment she walked out the door for good. He couldn't let that happen, so he had stopped her the only way he knew how. Jensen imagined the scene unfolding. Ashley in the basement, maybe getting one last thing before bed. John coming down the stairs behind her. He might have tried to talk to her first. Maybe he had asked her to stay, begged for another chance. But she had said no. She had meant it this time. And that was when everything changed. The coroner had determined that the first blow had come fast, hard enough to knock her off balance. The defensive wounds on her hands suggested she had fought, had tried to push him away, tried to claw at him even as he overpowered her. She had bled out slowly, conscious enough to know what was happening. And somehow in those final agonizing moments, she had found the strength to drag her fingers through her own blood and write his name. Jensen closed his eyes for a brief second before exhaling, grounding himself back in the present. The evidence was all there. The case was tightening, the puzzle pieces clicking into place. But the one thing he couldn't pull from reports or witness statements was the moment when John Wonder had decided to kill his wife. Not the violence itself, not the physical act. The moment before, the moment the thought turned into action. It was that line, so thin, so fragile, that had always fascinated Jensen. He had spent years studying killers, trying to understand what separated the ones who walked away from the ones who followed through. Because there was always a choice, a moment when the decision could still be unmade. But John had made his. Jensen opened his eyes, the weight of the case settling heavier on his shoulders. Outside, the city continued on, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded in this house. Cars passed, streetlights flickered, life moved forward. But for Ashli Erhardt, time had stopped in this basement. And for John Wonder, it was only a matter of time before justice caught up to him. Detective Michael Jensen had long since learned that murder was never just about the act itself. It was about the moments that led up to it, the subtle signs, the warning flares that no one noticed until it was too late. Murder didn't exist in a vacuum. It was the last desperate decision in a long sequence of choices, failures, and quiet escalations. Ashli Erhardt's death had been brutal, but it hadn't been spontaneous. Jensen sifted through her phone records, scrolling past months of texts, emails, and call logs. There was nothing immediately alarming, no direct threats, no blatant confessions. But the signs were there, woven into the fabric of her daily life, the slow withdrawal, the hesitation in her messages, the way she always seemed to be making excuses for why she had to check in with John, why she had to be careful about what she said, why she couldn't always meet her friends when she planned to. A month before she died, she had sent a message to her sister. "I just need to make it through this last stretch. Once I'm out, things will be better." But she had never made it out. Jensen turned his attention to John's records next. He wanted to understand the man sitting in the interview room down the hall, the man who had spent the last 24 hours refusing to answer the simplest of questions. What he found wasn't surprising. John's searches in the weeks leading up to the murder painted a clear picture. He had looked up Ashley's new apartment complex. He had researched divorce settlements. He had searched phrases like, "how to stop a divorce," and "what happens if your wife leaves you." In the days before her death, his searches had shifted. How long does it take to bleed out from a stab wound? What is the average prison sentence for manslaughter? Jensen felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had been doing this long enough to know what that meant. John had considered his options. He had weighed them, thought them through, and in the end, he had still chosen to kill her. It was premeditated, not in the meticulous way of a serial killer, not a carefully orchestrated plan, but in the sense that he had known exactly what he was capable of. He had let the thought linger long enough for it to take root, and once it did, there was no turning back. The next step in the investigation was reconstructing his movements after the murder. They knew he had left town almost immediately. Surveillance cameras at a gas station in Nebraska had caught him in the early morning hours, standing at the counter, buying nothing but a bottle of water and a pack of gum. No signs of panic, no blood on his clothes, just a man who looked eerily normal considering what he had just done. Jensen had seen that before. Some killers unraveled instantly. They sobbed. They turned themselves in. They made frantic phone calls, unable to process what they had done. Others were disturbingly calm. They knew instinctively that there was no undoing it, and because of that, they didn't waste energy pretending to be shocked. John Wonder had spent the past 2 days saying as little as possible. He hadn't demanded a lawyer, hadn't broken down. He had just sat there, waiting. Waiting for what? Jensen pushed back from his desk, exhaling slowly. Outside the interview room, Assistant DA Lauren Porter was waiting with a file in her hands. "We have the autopsy report," she said. Jensen took it, flipping through the pages. He already knew most of it. Ashli had been stabbed multiple times, the fatal wound delivered last. The defensive wounds on her hands suggested she had fought back, tried to escape. But there was something new. Jensen's eyes narrowed as he read. She had bruising on her wrists. Looks like she was restrained at some point. Porter crossed her arms. The marks suggest he grabbed her, probably held her down before the stabbing started. A fresh wave of anger burned in Jensen's chest. He had already known that Ashli had suffered, but this confirmed it. She hadn't just been killed. She had been overpowered, controlled, forced into submission before he took her life. She had known she wasn't going to survive, and she had written his name anyway. Jensen clenched his jaw, flipping the report shut. "That's all we need." Porter nodded. "The DA is filing for first-degree murder. This isn't just a crime of passion. He knew what he was doing." There was no more waiting. John Wonder was about to face justice. The morning air was heavy with the scent of rain, a low-pressure front rolling in over Kansas City. But inside the precinct, the weight in the room had nothing to do with the weather. The pieces of the case against John Wonder were coming together, each detail tightening around him like a noose. Detective Michael Jensen sat at his desk, reviewing the case file again, ensuring every fact, every timestamp, every thread of evidence was in place. Murder cases weren't won on instinct alone. They were built from the ground up, brick by meticulous brick. No detail could be overlooked. John Wonder had killed his wife in the early hours of the morning. That was no longer a question. The forensic evidence alone was enough to tie him to the crime scene. His blood mixed with Ashli's, the bruises on her wrists indicating a struggle, the defensive wounds proving she had fought back. But Jensen wanted more than just proof that he had done it. He wanted to understand. Why did he stay in the house for hours after the murder? Why did he not attempt to conceal her body or clean up the crime scene? Why did he drive in the direction he did, stopping only once before he was caught? To find those answers, Jensen had to retrace the path John had taken the moment he walked out of that basement. Security footage from a nearby traffic camera showed his car pulling out of the driveway at exactly 4:12 a.m. The taillights glowed red against the dark, cutting through the stillness of the sleeping neighborhood. He didn't speed. He didn't hesitate. He drove away like a man who had made up his mind. But where was he going? Jensen followed the digital trail. John had driven for nearly 2 hours before stopping at a gas station in Nebraska at 6:18 a.m. The surveillance footage showed him walking inside, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, expression unreadable. He bought nothing but a bottle of water and a pack of gum. No gas, no food, no supplies. He stood at the counter for less than a minute, paid in cash, and left. It was what he didn't do that stood out. He didn't check his phone. He didn't call anyone. He didn't change his clothes, didn't attempt to dispose of evidence. It was almost as if he wasn't trying to hide, just to put distance between himself and what he had done. Jensen pulled up the body cam footage from the arrest. The Nebraska troopers had found him parked at a rest stop off Highway 83. The engine had been off. He had been sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead at nothing. When they approached the car, he didn't resist, didn't ask why he was being detained. He had just let them cuff him and put him in the back of the squad car, as if he had already resigned himself to whatever was coming next. That was the part Jensen couldn't shake. Men who killed their wives usually followed a pattern. Some staged the crime scene to look like a burglary gone wrong. Some tried to flee, crossing state lines, booking flights under fake names. Some called the police themselves, pretending to be devastated, begging for help. John Wonder had done none of those things. Instead, he had driven 200 miles away, parked in a near-empty lot, and sat there, waiting. But waiting for what? Jensen flipped through the crime scene photos again, looking for anything he might have missed. The basement, the blood, the half-packed suitcase upstairs, the list of things Ashli had planned to take with her. Everything pointed to a woman on the verge of freedom, a woman who had almost made it out. And then there was the name written in blood, Wonder. Jensen had seen a lot of dying messages before. They were usually desperate, hastily scrawled attempts to name the killer, to leave behind something that could speak for the victim when they no longer could. But this one was different. Ashli hadn't written his full name, just Wonder. Jensen sat back in his chair, staring at the letters. Had she written it because she ran out of time? Because the pain was too much? Or had she written it because she knew exactly what it meant? His last name wasn't just a name. It was a word, an accusation, a final act of defiance. She wasn't just telling the police who had killed her. She was telling them why. John Wonder had spent years controlling her, slowly unraveling her sense of self, making her world smaller and smaller until leaving seemed impossible. And when she finally found the strength to break away, when she finally decided she wasn't going to be his anymore, he had snapped. She had died, but she had made sure the world would know who had taken her life. Jensen exhaled sharply, pushing back from his desk. He knew now why John had been sitting in his car for hours after the murder, because in that moment, he had lost. Ashli had won, and she had made sure he would never forget it. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the steps, cameras rolling, microphones poised. Inside, the air buzzed with tension, a mix of anticipation and quiet fury. The murder of Ashli Erhardt had become more than just another tragic crime. It had become a headline, a story that gripped people, that made them whisper about how fragile safety really was. A young woman, smart and ambitious, standing on the threshold of a new life. A man who couldn't let her go. The kind of crime that felt uncomfortably familiar. Assistant District Attorney Lauren Porter had prosecuted domestic homicides before. She knew how these cases played out, knew that juries didn't just convict on evidence, they convicted on emotion. If they could make people feel what Ashli must have felt in those final moments, then there would be no question of guilt. The case against John Wonder was strong. The physical evidence alone, his blood at the scene, the defensive wounds on Ashli's body, the chilling final message written in her own blood, was enough to build a rock-solid argument. But there was one thing that Porter knew could complicate everything. John wasn't talking. From the moment of his arrest, he had barely spoken a word. No confession, no statements of remorse, no panicked excuses or elaborate justifications. Just silence. That left room for reasonable doubt. Without a confession, the defense could argue anything. That Ashli had attacked him first, that it had been an accident, that someone else had been in the house that night, that her death, as brutal as it was, hadn't been what it seemed. Juries like certainty, and without hearing John's version of events, there was still a gap. His attorney, a defense lawyer named Stephen Cates, was experienced, a man who knew how to pull apart the state's narrative piece by piece. He had handled high-profile murder trials before, had won cases that should have been unwinnable, and now he was sitting across from John Wonder in a jailhouse conference room, preparing for the fight of his career. Jensen watched from the observation room as John sat across from his lawyer, an expression unreadable. He had expected him to break by now. Most men did. They cracked under the weight of their own guilt, buckled beneath the pressure of knowing what they had done. But John Wonder, he looked calm, too calm. The video feed caught the way his fingers tapped idly against the table, the faint flicker of something, maybe amusement, crossing his face as his lawyer spoke. It made Jensen's skin crawl. There was something off about him, not in the way of a remorseless psychopath, but in the way of a man who didn't seem to care. Didn't care that he had destroyed a life, didn't care that he had taken away someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. Or maybe he did care. Maybe he just enjoyed the attention. Jensen turned away from the screen, exhaling through his nose. It didn't matter what John felt. What mattered was making sure he never walked free again. The court proceedings would be brutal. Cates would do everything in his power to shift blame, to create uncertainty. But the evidence was unshakable. Ashli's bruises told the story. Her last text messages painted the picture. And the letters written in her blood? That was something no jury would forget. As the trial date loomed closer, the case exploded in the media. The story spread beyond Kansas City, beyond Missouri. It became national news. John Wonder wasn't just a man on trial for murder. He was a symbol of something larger, something that made people angry. Domestic violence, the cycle of control. The way women were so often failed by the systems meant to protect them. People dissected every detail of Ashli's life. Her social media posts were analyzed, her past relationships scrutinized. Friends were interviewed. People who had never met her spoke as if they had known her personally. And through it all, John Wonder sat in his cell, waiting. No statements, no emotions, just waiting. But for what? Jensen wasn't sure. But he knew one thing. John wasn't afraid of the trial, and that meant something else was coming. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, their eyes fixed on the defendant seated at the table beside his attorney. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a collective anticipation for what was about to unfold. The murder of Ashli Erhardt had captured national attention, turning what might have been just another tragic domestic homicide into a case that symbolized something larger, something far more unsettling. John Wonder sat in his chair, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He wore the standard-issued suit his defense team had provided, a calculated attempt to make him appear as something other than what he was. No shackles, no prison jumpsuit. Just a man, a husband, sitting before the court, accused but not yet convicted. Detective Michael Jensen stood near the back of the room, watching as the proceedings unfolded. The evidence against John was overwhelming, but Jensen had been in this business long enough to know that trials weren't always about evidence. They were about perception. The prosecution's opening statement was measured and deliberate. Assistant DA Lauren Porter spoke clearly, her voice unwavering as she walked the jury through the undeniable facts of the case. She laid out the timeline, detailing Ashli's final hours, her desperate attempt to leave a message in her own blood, the forensic evidence that placed John at the scene, and the chilling silence he had maintained ever since. This case is not about speculation, she told the jury. This case is about what we know. We know that Ashli Erhardt was murdered in the early hours of the morning. We know that she suffered, and we know that she fought to tell us with her dying breath exactly who killed her. She let the words settle before turning to face the defense table, and that man is sitting right there. Jensen watched the jury carefully, noting their expressions, their subtle shifts in posture. Some looked at John with barely concealed disgust. Others, more reserved, remained impassive. But there was something in the room, an undercurrent of certainty, that told him they saw what he saw. They saw a guilty man. Then it was the defense's turn. John's attorney, Stephen Cates, took his time standing, adjusting his tie before addressing the jury. His voice was smooth, confident, designed to chip away at their certainty, to plant the seed of doubt. This case is about tragedy, he said. It is about loss and grief and the way emotions can cloud the truth. Jensen felt his jaw tighten. He knew exactly where this was going. Detective Jensen and the prosecution have done a commendable job constructing a narrative. They want you to believe that John Wonder is a monster, that this crime was premeditated, that there is no room for doubt. But the law does not work on certainty, it works on evidence. And what does the evidence really say? He paused, letting his words sink in. No eyewitnesses, no confession, and only one person's version of events, a version written in blood, in the final moments of fear and chaos. Jensen could feel the shift in the air, the subtle way the jury leaned in, considering the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the prosecution's story wasn't as airtight as they thought. That was the power of a good defense attorney. They didn't need to prove innocence. They just needed to make someone doubt guilt. The prosecution's first witness was Ashli's sister, Rachel Erhardt. She took the stand with visible effort, her hands clasped together in her lap, her breathing shallow. Losing a loved one to murder was one kind of pain. Reliving it in front of a jury, in front of the man who had done it, was another entirely. She spoke about Ashli's last few months, about the plans she had made, about the way she had seemed nervous but hopeful as she prepared to move out. Did Ashli ever express fear for her safety? Porter asked. Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. Yes. Fear of whom? She didn't hesitate. John? Kate stood for the cross-examination, his movements slow and deliberate. Ms. Erhardt, he began, his tone almost sympathetic. Your sister never filed for a restraining order, did she? Rachel's expression darkened. She didn't think she needed one. She thought she was safe. And yet she continued living in the same house as my client for months after their separation. She didn't have a choice, Rachel snapped. She couldn't afford to leave right away. Cates didn't react, didn't argue. He simply nodded, letting her frustration do the work for him. Ms. Erhardt, he continued, you said your sister was nervous in the weeks leading up to her move. Is it possible she was simply stressed? That her emotions were heightened due to the pressure of starting over? Rachel's hands curled into fists, her voice tightening. She was scared of him. She told me so. But she never reported any incidents of violence? She didn't think anyone would believe her. Cates turned slightly, addressing the jury as much as the witness. Or perhaps, Miss Erhardt, your sister was feeling overwhelmed by the situation. Perhaps her fears were not based in reality, but in the stress of leaving a marriage. That would explain why she never sought legal protection, wouldn't it? Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. She's dead now, isn't she? For the first time, the carefully rehearsed poise on Cates's face faltered, a small, fleeting crack in his mask. Jensen smirked. Rachel had landed the first blow. Over the next few days, the prosecution laid out their case with precision. The medical examiner testified about Ashli's wounds, the clear signs of struggle, the pattern of injuries that pointed to a prolonged attack, not a sudden outburst. The forensic team presented their findings. The blood spatter patterns, the fingerprints, the DNA evidence that placed John directly at the scene in the moments before and after her death. Jensen took the stand as well, walking the jury through the investigation, step by step, showing how each piece fit together into an unshakable truth. And yet Cates fought back every step of the way. He argued that the forensics were circumstantial, that the timeline had gaps, that Ashli's own state of mind could not be definitively known. It was a battle, a slow, grinding war of attrition. And John Wonder? He just sat there, watching, unbothered, unmoved. Jensen didn't trust it. Didn't trust the way John seemed almost entertained by the process, like he was waiting for something Jensen couldn't see yet. But he would, he was sure of that, because there was no way John Wonder was going to let this trial end without trying to take control one last time. Jensen could feel it coming, and whatever it wasn't going to be good. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that came with waiting, with tension stretched so thin it could snap at any moment. The jury had been deliberating for over 6 hours, their discussions locked behind a heavy wooden door while the world outside held its breath. Detective Michael Jensen sat in the back of the courtroom, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He had been through this process before, watching jurors weigh the evidence, knowing that no matter how airtight a case seemed, nothing was guaranteed. John Wonder sat at the defense table, his face impassive. He had been like that through the entire trial, unbothered, unreadable, a man waiting to see if he had outplayed everyone in the room. Even now, as the bailiff announced the jury's return, as the foreman took his place and unfolded the verdict sheet, he barely reacted. The judge's voice cut through the stillness. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. Jensen barely breathed as the words were spoken, as the papers were passed between the judge and the clerk. He didn't look at John, didn't need to. He was focused on one thing only: justice for Ashli Erhardt. The clerk read aloud, voice steady, unwavering. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. There was no outburst, no dramatic cries or protests, just a sharp inhale from the gallery, a collective release of air from those who had been holding on to hope. John didn't move, didn't flinch. He just sat there staring straight ahead. Jensen watched him carefully. He had seen killers break down before, some with anger, some with shock, some with an odd kind of relief, as if the weight of their guilt had finally been lifted. But John, nothing, not a single flicker of emotion. Maybe he had convinced himself this wouldn't happen. Maybe he had truly believed that his lawyer could poke enough holes in the prosecution's case, that someone on that jury would hesitate, that doubt would be enough to save him. But now there was nothing left to manipulate, no one left to control. He had lost. The judge thanked the jury, then turned to the defense and prosecution for final arguments before sentencing. Lauren Porter, composed as always, made the state's position clear. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Cates, ever the fighter, argued for leniency and appealed to the court's humanity, to John's lack of prior violent offenses. But everyone in that room knew the truth. John Wonder had killed Ashli because he couldn't stand the idea of losing her. And he had done it in one of the most brutal, personal ways possible. He had made sure she suffered, and she had made sure the world knew who had done it. The judge's voice rang out, steady and firm. John Wonder, you have been found guilty of the premeditated murder of Ashli Erhardt. Your crime was an act of brutality, an unforgivable violation of trust and human decency. This court finds no justification, no mitigating factor that would warrant anything less than the maximum sentence allowable under the law. A pause, a final breath before the weight of the words settled. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was over. John sat there for a moment longer, his fingers twitching slightly against the table. The first movement of real emotion Jensen had seen from him all trial. A twitch, a flex, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he had finally begun to understand what had happened. But it was too late. The bailiffs moved in, securing the cuffs around his wrists, leading him out through the side doors. Rachel Erhardt, Ashli's sister, let out a shaky breath. Justice. Not enough to bring Ashli back, but enough to make sure John Wonder never took another step as a free man again. Jensen stepped outside, the cool evening air filling his lungs. The case was closed. The trial was done. The system had worked this time, but it was always like this. Too late. He turned his eyes toward the darkened sky, toward the streetlights blinking on, toward the world moving forward even as Ashli's had come to an end. Somewhere, in another house, another woman was packing a suitcase, thinking she was finally free, and Jensen could only hope her story wouldn't end the same way. The cell door slammed shut behind him. John Wonder didn't flinch, didn't turn to look as the guard locked him in. He simply sat on the edge of the cot, staring at the gray concrete wall in front of him. A lifetime of this. This was all he had left. There were no appeals coming, no last-minute legal maneuvers. The judge had made it clear. He was never going to walk free again. He had lost. But he had lost long before the trial. He had lost the moment Ashli decided to leave him. The moment she looked at him and saw not a husband, not a partner, but a man she needed to escape from. The rage had built slowly over time, the control slipping, little by little, until the night it all came crashing down. And now here he was, trapped, forever. There were no more excuses left to make. Detective Michael Jensen stood outside the courthouse, watching as the last of the news crews packed up their cameras, their lights. The trial was over. The headlines were already changing. A new case, a new tragedy, another cycle of violence to be dissected on the evening news. That was how it always went. Ashli Erhardt's name would fade from the public eye, replaced by the next big story. People would stop talking about her, stop posting about her. Her face, once plastered across every screen, would become just another file in a cold case archive. But Jensen wouldn't forget, not the way she fought back, not the way she had written his name in her own blood. Some victims never got to speak, never got to name their killers, but Ashli had, and that was what had sealed John Wonder's fate. Jensen exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Justice had been served, but justice didn't bring people back. It just left an empty space where they used to be. Rachel Erhardt walked through Ashli's old apartment. The lease had been in her sister's name, but now it was just another thing that needed to be cleaned out, packed up, erased. The space was small but bright, the kind of place that had felt full of possibility. Ashli had chosen it carefully, close enough to work, far enough from the life she was trying to leave behind. Rachel traced her fingers along the kitchen counter, remembering the way Ashli had talked about decorating, about making it hers. She had been so close. One more week, and she would have been here, alive, happy, free. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to keep moving. There was too much to do. clothes to donate, boxes to pack, a life to sort through, piece by painful piece. She found Ashley's planner on the nightstand, flipped through the pages, notes, reminders, dreams, a future she had never gotten to live. Rachel closed the book, pressing it against her chest as she fought back tears. John Wonder had taken her sister's life, but he hadn't taken who she was. That was something he would never get to touch. The world moved on. Kansas City went back to normal. People got up, went to work, lived their lives. The trial became just another statistic in the endless stream of crime reports. But somewhere, someone else was making plans, packing a bag, looking for a way out, thinking they had time, thinking it wouldn't happen to them. Jensen had seen too many cases to believe that Ashli would be the last. There was always another story waiting to unfold, another name that would make the headlines, and another man who would sit in an interrogation room, believing, for just a moment, that he could get away with it. But in the end, the truth always came out, and blood never lied. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.